Okay, welcome to episode 69 of the SumerSports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff of this podcast namesake. Thomas, welcome back. How's how's the summer going?
It's going well. What is it? June 19th. Here we are. Literally, interestingly enough, I just finished watching the final episode of Succession. So I'm all twisted around. Any of those Succession fans. But more important, I love this time of year for the general managers. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that. I every once in a while go back to the idea of what would I have been doing if I were to still be sitting in the seat. And I look forward to talking about that with you. It's got a lot of layers to it, I think.
Yeah, for sure. That's kind of what I want to talk about today now that you're back, because we've had I think a really good group of guests. We had Brad Spielberger from PFF. We had Bill Connolly from ESPN. We had even some people within our own walls come in and do some things. And, I think that there's a great deal of insight there. We did a quarterback draft, a head coach draft, and a non-quarterback draft. Those were a lot of fun. But, where this podcast, I think, stands out is kind of your insight and where we can't get this anywhere else. And this time of year, right? Like, I think about this time, we're just finishing mini camps. OTAs are in the back, beyond the back burner. You also have the draft a couple months in arrears already, and yet training camp is still a good month to 6 weeks away. There are a lot of big name free agents in the NFL right now, and there's a lot of like musing about what these teams are thinking. You've actually been in this chair before. What are general managers thinking about right now?
Well, I mean, let's start and look at it this way. What they're thinking about right now is school is out for the effing summer. I hate to tell you that, all the fan base out there, these guys are so enervated by this time of year. They just finished mini camps and OTAs, as you mentioned. It's in the middle of June. Everyone cannot wait to step back, be with their families, love on their families, their wives and their kids, be together, take a deep breath, maybe go on a couple-week vacation. While they're doing that, however, and we'll continue to talk about it, they may be doing a deal here and there. They may be having their salary cap guy back in the office every once in a while, putting finishing touches, Eric, on the signings of the draft picks, right? You haven't run all the numbers on that. I'm sure there are still some out there that need to be signed, sealed, and delivered. So what I really want to lead in on is this is a really interesting time. And when I said there are layers to it, Eric, I would say, again, most people cannot wait to get away from football because it is something that's been in their world so much, and it's occupied so much of their energy. They love it beyond, but again, this is a time where they're taking their space, and then they can come back with a fresh mind, of course, at the beginning of training camp.
Yeah, it's such an interesting, because I've never worked for a team, and it's funny because even at Sumer, but also at Pro Football Focus, where I was, like, the months of June, July, August are kind of when you're trying to finish the stuff up for the season, content and all that. And so in many ways, that's a very condensed time for people in sort of the football media space. For people in the football space, it's actually, there will be people that'll take a month off, and there will be people that will sort of unwind, and for good reason. I mean, if you're a player evaluator, let's say you're a scout or even an analytics person that works on that side of the business, like, you've been going from, let's say, November in a lot of ways until April, and then you're packing it all up, for that one draft cycle. If you're in the pro side, it's a little bit, it's shifted a little bit, but in a lot of ways, you're still in a really tough spot because you just simply don't have the time to unwind. Because everything is sort of on a schedule from basically late July until just right about now, everything's on a schedule for these people that work for teams. And so they have to sort of refresh during that time. Thomas, this is the time, I would imagine, for somebody in your shoes as a GM to reevaluate what your assumptions are, to reevaluate what your long-term planning is. In a weird way, it's the one time I think you probably have a little bit of peace and quiet in your own mind.
Sure. I mean, remember, draft's over at the beginning of May. So you think about May and half of June. There's a month and a half to do a lot of the thinking that you need to do, Eric, for the most part. Meaning you're talking to your head coaches a lot. You're talking to your personnel people. Usually you're getting in a summer scouting report on the next wave of players that are coming out in the draft. We used to call it, beach reading material. We'd sit out there and read all the scouts reports during that time, do our underlining. I mean, I took that lead from Scott Pioli. He was an underlining master, but we would take time doing that type of stuff. We would look at our financials. It was digging back into what we knew was important going into the fall. But like you said, you could get up and have your coffee. You're not racing off to the office. You don't have this angst hanging over your head. You might make a call to your assistant GM. You might make a call to a scout here and there. More importantly, you might call your owner, or you might not. More than often, the person that you will communicate with would be your head coach. If you're a GM, you're going to call your head coach with an idea or two. He would call you as well, and you would talk a little bit. Well, Dan Quinn used to be out in Hawaii, and I would be out in Boulder, Colorado, and we would just have light conversations. We made sure that they weren't too deep. I rarely, in those 12 and a half, 13 off seasons, did I ever have any catastrophic issues during that time. I think you had alluded to it in one of the things that you want to talk about, and I don't want to get off on that until you bring it up. But, there are people out there that are dealing with some pretty heavy stuff during that time. So this ideal moving away for the summer isn't as easy for them, right? They're dealing with some pretty deep stuff. And that could be a bad contract gone bad, or health issues with someone, or et cetera, et cetera. So the last thing I want to say about that is, remember, though, I keep saying this, but there's such a relief knowing that at the middle of June, you can walk out that door and not feel guilty about not coming in every day, because every owner's checked off on it. You could go to virtually any building right now and you would see it's like the dark ages. You might have one or two people sitting in their department for a week at a time, usually the lower level people, right? They're doing a week or two in the office, and then they're off for about 3 weeks, right? So there's a little bit of shifting around that way.
Yeah, for sure. And that's only part of a healthy situation. I know that football at times can be, and you're, as being one of the more progressive people in the league, like, I would say that you guys probably were more healthy and functional than a lot of teams. But like, what I do like is that this month of June and July for them is mostly sacred in that regard, which is great, because you do need to take that time off. And that, be that as it may, it's funny that a lot of the thorny issues happen right now. So like, just a few that are being brought up, like, for example, the Kansas City Chiefs just off a Super Bowl. They have Chris Jones at a $28 million number right now, whether or not to give him an extension, right? That has connections to DeAndre Hopkins, who's has been one of the best receivers in all of football. He's now available. He's taken some team meetings, but for the most part, he's unsigned, and there really isn't a beat on whether he's going. Then you have guys like Dalvin Cook who are free agents. You have situations like that, and then you have what Mojel just asked, which is what would Thomas do with Stephon Diggs? He says he wants a say in play calling and not being at the facility. Like, you have a situation where Stephon Diggs is one of the best players in the entire league at his position. He comes into minicamp, sits out a day because there's a misunderstanding or something like that going on in the building, and now you have to take that with you, in theory, to your vacation. You have to have 1 year on that. Like, those things are weird, right? Because they can, in a lot of ways, they're thought of as make or break situations, when in the most part, most of the hay theoretically is in the barn. You just have to deal with these sort of one-off transient type of things that are going on with your team.
Well, that's a great point. Look, I'm making a fairly light of it, meaning you're off and you're completely off as much as you can on any given year, sometimes a little bit more involved. Sometimes there are situations that, demand your attention, and your owner wants your attention on it. And there were times that I was dealing with agents during that time. But again, there's a lot more relaxedness, sort of being relaxed about it. I will say a lot of teams also think if they're in a situation with a signing or a contract situation that's becoming complicated, they know that they're coming back the week before training camp starts, right, Eric? Normally GMs and their staff will come back then. So their eyes are focused on getting as much done then when they come back. But again, unless, and I'm not saying everyone, right? Look, I've talked to a couple of teams who say, Thomas, there's never a vacation. And believe me, I know there are certain head coaches and GMs who aren't doing that, to your point, but they are looking at what's out there, and they do think that there may be opportunities when everyone else is kicking, their feet up and they're in the sand, that other people are working hard at it. I just think being smart about it, making sure that you are able to take your deep breaths and get your health. You can still do deals during this time. I know I'm going in circles on, I'm sorry, Eric, but you brought it up. I remember having probably 2 or 3 different times when I was in completely acrimonious discussions with an agent that I was able to put aside while I went away. Right. So I think there's a way to do that.
Yeah. It's so funny, right? Whenever I put up this podcast, I do the hashtags of management and all this stuff and like decision making and leadership, because it is part of that. I think we've all been here in our career where there's one night, and I had one last week, where I'm like, I've been on this all day. I'm not going to get better at this right now. I need to get some sleep. I need to recharge. I need to move on. And NFL football is probably even more efficient than what I was working on at the time, meaning there isn't an edge to be had right now in the NFL, for most part. All of you have your opinion on DeAndre Hopkins, right? It just depends upon which strike price he's going to agree to, right? Everybody has their opinion on Dalvin Cook. It just depends upon whose strike price. I feel like the time that you are spending recharging and rethinking and allowing yourself some leeway physically and mentally, that has way more of an advantage than trying to pick up that last dollar bill off the ground in NFL free agency right now. That, to me, I think you're making a fairly solid trade-off by doing that. But that's just me. I just think, for my money, there's nothing about DeAndre Hopkins that isn't already known, right? It's just whatever's supposed to happen is going to happen. You being at the office one extra day during the month of June is probably not going to get it done relative to anybody else, is sort of my point.
Yeah, and I think if you look back to years and years ago, I mean, having been in this league in professional football for 28 in the NFL, 2 in the CFL, 1 in the world, 31 years, it's been fairly consistent, although people are so much more in tune with what you're talking about, making sure that they're of sound mind, making sure they're of fresh mind, making sure that they're eating properly, all of the stuff that are the older generation would respectfully, I don't even know if it's respectful, would poo-poo and say, are you kidding me? Grind, even if you have a couple of days off. I guess what I'm saying now is people are so much more aware of that, so they're not feeling bad about doing that, so that they are fresh when they're having to make their decisions. Look, when you brought up the other day to me, and I believe it was in our interaction when you were talking about, okay, are the coaches doing the same? The coaches are probably the first one out the door, by the way. They want the hay in the barn with their scheme, with adjustments. It does not mean in any way, Eric, that they're not, calling the head coach and their coordinators and having discussions. Hey, one last thing. Of course that can happen. But they are trying to get out the door with everything in place, which is a really good point to talk about, because everyone would think that something would come up, while they were away, and how do they bring that back into the fold? They're in again a week before training camp starts usually, and able to dabble and put some finishing touches on some scheme adjustments oftentimes.
Yeah. Do you think that there are a lot of coaches who spend this time off just as a hobby, watching college film, or watching, if you're Shanahan, you're watching McVay's film or something like that? Or has that study has all been done, right? That study is all part of the putting the hay in the barn at this time? Or is it I think a lot of us who have, interest in these things, we'll go and kind of have guilty pleasures when we go on our vacations. We'll read a book about a different area of math, or we'll read a book about the CFL if we're an NFL coach, or something like that. I feel like that's more creative. But you're saying, though, that these coaches are saying, look, we're trying, we're gonna finish up install basically right now before we go on vacation in June, and then we're gonna kind of work around that once we get back. But for the most part, they're not reinventing anything right now, which I think makes sense. Do you think that is why some of these, basically post-draft, they're so hesitant to get new players into the fold, even though there are a lot of players right now who are veterans who are have been pretty good in the NFL. Marcus Peters, Ezekiel Elliott, guys like that who are without a team because in some ways teams are already finalizing their plans. And if a player doesn't fit into them, and it's increasingly less likely that a player will fit into them the later we get in this process, those plans are being finalized by these teams.
And again, that's contingent on the head coach, right? Normally, Mike Smith was very different than Dan Quinn, right? Mike Smith was really cast in his ways as far as the team. When we were approaching the middle of June, there is no way. We weren't aggressive and active. We had our group in place. It's why we were one of the biggest draft retention teams during those 6 or 7 years we were with Mike, because that's how he wanted it. Where Dan came in, it was different, right? Dan and his group were always looking to upgrade. So we were much more aggressive with our turnover. Sometimes that can be good. Sometimes it can be a challenge. So to me, it's contingent on the head coach and their styles. I will say, even though with both of them, though, most wanted everything in place as much as possible before we left. Not saying a deal couldn't get done later, but that's a good feeling, knowing that you have everything wrapped up and you're ready to come back, the last week of July and start your work together, which is another really important point, which I know you're going to talk to me about. When you start talking about the scheme being in place, what about the roster being in place?
Well, for sure. And that's, by the way, for the sports bettors that like to listen to the show, which I know we're not explicitly sports betting, but there are a lot of bettors that listen to the show. That is a good thing about, like, take injuries out of the situation. Like, most of these teams are going into the season with who's on the roster right now, and their plans are fairly made up. The question, I guess, is, Thomas, from your perspective, how much of it is made up? Let's say you took injuries out of the equation. Of the 53 guys that you need to bring week 1, 46 that you need to dress. Now I think it's 47. 46 that you need to dress. Like, how many of those do you know, like, this time every year?
Look, I know some people are aghast when I say this, but today's very different than it used to be, of course. So all the practice and all the time with OTAs and everything leading up to the dismissal in mid-June and then back at beginning or the last part of July. I used to say with Mike Smith and Dan Quinn, we were pretty close to, I'd say 85% set, if not more, in any given year. Which is amazing to me, because people think, wow, they come back to training camp. I'm saying, yeah, but they've all been working so hard. It's not like back in the day, they would leave, they were fiddling around in the spring and they were working a banking job and they were working for, selling for Budweiser. These guys have all been working their tails off. So they get a little bit of a break, the 3 weeks or 4 weeks, and they come back, they hit the ground running. They're expected to be in shape, and everything's rolling. We get into the games, we get into the practice and the preseason games. And then all of a sudden you think, I've sat down there with Dan Quinn, especially those last 4 years. And I'd say, Dan, I think we are where we are. And, Arthur Blank would be asking, like, where is this going to be interesting how this changes? And I had to really say, like, we are pretty much where we think we are. Every once in a while, a guy would have a good final stretch. I remember a running back one time, without mentioning names. He was slapping it around, but the last 2 or 3 games, he started running his ass off and he made our team. He was so far cut back in, June, July, or June and August, or June, July, excuse me. So I find that fascinating.
I'm trying to think in my mind who this running back is, and just to guess off the top of my head, but I won't ruin it.
Well, I guess the reality on this is that, most teams are pretty damn close to where they are because they have a really good feel. You can get creative. I think you can get not only creative, but if you can find someone that fits your scheme, but also fits the mentality of how you're approaching things, right? You've mentioned some guys already, some of these free agents. And the reality is, a coach and his staff are like feeling so good about getting everything in that compartment finally. Do they want that wayward soul to come in, though good, to put a twist in their leadership and their approach?
Yeah, that's such an interesting topic. I've actually been kind of nerding out a little bit over the history of the league, and mostly around, like, when free agency started to happen, because I think what you're describing is a function, a lot of ways, of free agency, right? Where players have gotten more power they've used that to make themselves into better players. And so a lot of more physically fit and all that kind of stuff. To the point now where, to your point, training camp isn't really like a figuring out exercise. I mean, you go back, Thomas, I was watching a preseason game from 1988 on the TV. It was played in Switzerland. Vern Lundquist, a Swede himself, was like loving, he was just loved the spectacle. It was a preseason game, Thomas, between the Bears and the Vikings. The Bears and the Vikings play in the same division. Not in nowhere on God's green earth today would we see division rivals playing the preseason. But this was back when they played 4. It wasn't that far ago from when they were playing 6, right?
Yeah.
And they're playing a quarter and a half, even the starters, against division rivals, right? Like the training camp was about to figure stuff out because we didn't have the athlete optimized the way that we do now. And I think the other part is when you add free agency onto it, you have the salary cap as well. And this what's really funny was in the early 90s, right when they sort of agreed to the new CBA, they used to have this situation where you had to cut from 53 to 47. And there would be this pool of waivers players and it'd be like Mike Tice, like guys like that who are like 47 on every roster. But like you'd have to go through this situation where you had to cut down to 47 and see if anyone wanted a bite out of your players. And then you'd re-sign the last 5 or 6 guys on your roster. Like there were just so many mechanisms before the salary cap where you would be able to do roster turnover. And it's just different now. Roster turnover all just happens in February, March, April now. And once you get into July, August, your veterans, they can take their guaranteed pay, right? Like if you cut them out, they're on the roster week 1 and you somehow go sideways with them, you cut them one time in their career, they can take the rest of their season P5 and make it guaranteed. So like there's something there. There's just a lot of salary cap implications to getting rid of veterans now that never existed, of course, before there was a salary cap.
You hit the nail on the head. I would say this as well. Most general managers and personnel department, they want to come in with nothing else done after June 15th, right? Because they want to be perceived like they have everything in order, that the owner is looking at them, that they've gotten everything T's crossed, I's dotted. The last thing they want is a mercurial head coach or coaching staff who's just, every time they turn around, they're getting a call. Hey, this guy's available now. We should go in and get him. It becomes a bone of contention, right? And yet you always want to help the head coach get to where he wants to get to. But if you have a nervous head coach, if you have a new head coach, or if you have an older head coach who just has a penchant for wanting to turn the roster upside down, but that's not something that we as a team builder, as a general manager in the team builder part, really want to be a part of, right?
You have an interesting experience too, where you had 1 year of rebuilding 08, right? And you were, I think, a 3-13 team the previous year. So you're high on the waiver claim list. You were immediately good. And then, 2013, 2014 weren't great, but you weren't like the worst team in football. So you still weren't like first on the waiver list. And in a weird way, because you talk about Dan Quinn, when Quinn was in Seattle in 10 and 11, I think, that first like few years of Pete Carroll, they had more transactions than any team in the league. To your point of, I think some of it is also the earlier you are, the more freedom you're given to turn over past players. But in a weird way, in your experience, you weren't afforded that for that long because you took over in 08. You made some moves, of course. I think most of your moves were done when most teams make moves, like signing Michael Turner and drafting Matt Ryan and so forth. But like you guys almost weren't, you were so good out the gate in 08 that you were never really in a position, maybe until Dan got there in 15, to really say, hey, this roster needs some turnover, because evidently the initial one did so well. You guys were in the playoffs right away. And I think at least this was my impression back in 13 and 14 with the Falcons, is that it's not that you guys didn't have good players. It was just some things went kind of sideways a little bit. So you didn't really have a ton to overturn in 15 when Dan got in there. So it's kind of funny. I think for a lot of teams, Thomas, do you think that they're more likely to turn over the roster because of where they are in their rebuild stage this time of year?
Oh, yeah. And that's a good thing. Let's backtrack to 14 and 13. Remember, those of you who are aficionados of the game, I mean, we were we were on the tail end. Mike Smith and Mike Nolan were thinking about changing. You remember the banter? It was all about, we were a 4-3 and we were going to shift to a 3-4. Not only did we do it that in those 2 years, we were talking about getting big, right? We were talking about getting knocked around way too much in this 4-3 athletic scheme. So we were going to go big. We did it on the offensive side. And I love Mike Tice, by the way. I know he's a former Viking and everything. I really like him. I like his son Nate a lot. Mike and I always got along really well. But he wanted bigs, brother. He wanted 350s and 60s. And all we had was a whole bunch of 305s. So on the offensive side, we were doing that, scurrying like crazy as a personnel department and as a GM to try to get it right for Mike Smith, trying to push in. I remember Arthur whispering in my ears, Thomas, this is a very, very important year for Mike Smith. We need big. We ended up drafting Rashid Hageman, if you remember, right? Mm-hmm. Probably shouldn't have done that, as good as athletic as he was. We were trying to go big. We were switching our scheme, which is another thing, right? Think about a complete switch of scheme, adding people to your roster, Eric, adding contracts to your roster, the year that there might be a change. I told Arthur after the fact, and again, you know my feelings about Smitty, love him, and Arthur and all that, but that's a precarious spot to be in, right? You're going into the summer, and all you're doing is saying, we are going big. You have all this money tied up into all these big guys, and we know if things go awry, the percentage of people, not that we were ever even focused on Dan Quinn, but think about that. Dan comes into the Falcons organization, athlete, speed, and all we had are all these big heavies, not all. So,
well, I mean, you got yourself out of that fairly well with drafts. You know, you hit on Dion, you hit on Devondre Campbell. I mean, but you're right. I mean, it's awkward, right? And part of that is how tied head coach and GM are, because you don't want to be like, hey, Mike, I'm going to have to split the difference between what you want and what the next guy wants. You're never going to say that. That's not politically popular. That's not right. And in fact, you don't know. I mean, I'm imagining it was, you know, a coin flip whether or not they were going to keep you and Smith, or, you know, that's like, all those things are just a really tough situation. But that's interesting. And then you're sitting there, and we've all, like, from me in sports betting and you and, you know, running an NFL team, we've all been in a place where we're like, I got this wager down. I'm not happy about it. I gotta let it ride, and I'm not sure if the ingredients are all quite there. You know, you'd like, and that's part of a football team, right? And that's part of like being, you know, that's part of being in a situation where you have to drive to consensus. I mean, we have it at Sumer. Like, you and I don't agree with everything that happens at Sumer, but we have to agree and commit, because, you know, that's how these things work. And sometimes in the process of doing that, you're stuck on a 6-week vacation where you're like, well, I don't know if our linebackers can be able to get sideline to sideline.
Well, look, I love that analogy. Think about, here's Arthur, right, as the owner. Here's a head coach his seat is really, really hot. And you think about, and here's the general manager, right, to the right, saying, okay, am I going to be around if this gets so hot and you're going to make a move on a head coach? And yet my words are you sure we want to spend 50, 60, 80, $100 million on all these guys that are going to be potentially a 1-year stop for us, and we're going to be just laden with dead money, and yet you want to give your head coach all the go ahead, right? Think about that precarious spot that the owner's in. You go to the owner or the head coach and say, sorry, man, you're hot. You are hot as hell, and you're going to have to do it with a 4-3 defense, or you're going to have to do it with smaller O linemen. Well, wait a minute. Do you not believe in me? Well, yeah, I do. Okay, well, let's do it. So you spend a ton of money. You bring people in who end up putting you behind as an organization. That can happen, right? Financially, for a new head coach to come in. So it's
right. And we've seen that with, you know, and I know you like Rick Spielman a lot. We were on Rick's show at the Super Bowl. A very good insight when we were on his show. But like, that's what Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. Like, a lot of people are looking at his moves in Minnesota. You let Thielen, who's a stalwart, Dalvin Cook, who's a stalwart. You have to get a pay cut on Harrison Smith. And everybody's like, well, are these good or bad decisions by Kwesi? And it's like, well, I don't know if they were even his decisions to make. Like, these were decisions that somebody made for him 2 years ago when they decided to try to win in 21. They can't win in 21. Unfortunately, everybody loses their job. He comes in, and the contracts in a lot of cases, this is what people, maybe we'll go through like an example of this on a different show. But like you look at a contract and you're like Daniil Hunter's contract. He's not playing in 2023 for what he's making, right? Just to give you basically what they did is push a lot of bonus money into the future. So his cap hit this year is 13 million, but his new money is only 5.5 million. And so you're thinking about a premier edge player only making 5.5 million, but he's 13 against the cap. So it's sort of this like vortex of like, it's not good for anybody. And it's not good for anybody because of a decision that was made 2 years ago, not a decision that they're currently dealing. Like the contract oftentimes will make a decision for you. By the way, Thomas, you never listened to one of these live. Speaking of a contract making a decision for you, the one that we signed with Manscaped means that I'm reading on air. That was a decision that was made for me. About a month ago, Manscaped sent us their kits. Thomas has one in his office. I have one in my office. They're great. I know Father's Day was yesterday. Sometimes you forget to get your father or your significant other a gift. Manscaped.com, promo code Sumer gets you 20% off. That would be a great gift to give Father's Day if you forgot. I like the Weed Whacker. It helps me with my nose hair, helps me with my ear hair. Obviously, the Lawnmower 4.0. Look, well, I've been talking, Thomas, about legacies here. We have the Shanahans. I didn't even realize that the team that I kind of root for in the CFL, your dad was the head coach. Like, we have all these the Lawnmower, though, it's on 4.0. There aren't that many football families that are 4 generations deep. That just shows you the longevity of Manscaped. So manscaped.com, Sumer as the promo code. You'll get 20% off and help support the show.
Hey,
Thomas,
bro, I just love hearing that. First time, I want the Manscaped people to hear prior to even doing this deal. I mean, you guys have been it's my go-to. It's always been my go-to. I have all the people at the where I get my hair cut. They're like, no, you should use this and this brand. I'm like, no, these are the dudes. This is the place to go. So I'm so glad you're doing such a great job with it. And when I came into my office before and after being away for a bit, seeing this package from Manscaped, I'm like, God, that stuff is just rolling now. This is what we need to be using. It's brand new, and I can give my son maybe my old stuff. So thank you, Manscaped.
Exactly. They've been a good partner so far. By the way, July 1st, we're gonna have another partner as well. So we're gonna have a couple ads right on the show. Really excited for those folks as well. Again, we appreciate every one of you for stopping by, making the SumerSports Show a weekly, daily even part of your life. We really do appreciate that. Thomas and I are talking right now about this time sort of in the football calendar. We've talked about what's it like for a GM? How much time do people get off? Thomas, I'm going to tell you that, though, now that you're on the vendor side, you're the dark side here. We don't get as much of June, July off as we got before. So it's going to be a little bit of a weird feeling for you. And then, how much of the 53 players are sort of determined, how much turnover, all that kind of stuff. I think for the most part, you're saying that most of the decisions are already made. I think one of the ways to track this, by the way, is if you look at the betting markets and look at the futures and say like how much of these prices moving from June until August. The answer is barely anything unless like a quarterback gets hurt or something like that. These teams are going to be fairly priced, and that's because a lot of what we know about the teams are known right now, and that's a comforting thing. You never, Thomas, had kind of what I'm calling like the Teddy Bridgewater knee situation, right? Where we talk about Rick, and he had a pretty good team in Minnesota, young quarterback. And I can remember where I was living in the Twin Cities metro area at the time, and Teddy collapses on the field, a couple ligaments, bleeds out, right? They got to change a ton. They got to go trade a first-round pick to the Eagles for Sam Bradford. They bring in a new quarterback really fast, try to make it all work. I think they finished 500 that year. They were in the NFC title game the following season, so it wasn't all that bad. You've never, like, from what I can tell, never had something that catastrophic kind of happen in the August month. When you're a GM, though, and that kind of stuff happens, like what instruments are available to you? You're almost, I mean, you're buying everything at a premium at that point, right?
Buying everything at a premium for sure. I want to make sure I'm understanding your question. What other instruments, as far as how do you get yourself out of that bind?
Yeah, so it's funny because I remember watching the Vikings played the Rams in a preseason game like 2 days after Bridgewater tore his knee up, and they were going to go into the season, bless his heart, with Sean Hill at quarterback, which just wasn't going to work. Like Sean, think he's everyman kind of quarterback. By the way, one of my former colleagues at PFF, Zach Robinson, who's now the quarterbacks coach for the Rams, used to talk about how like Sean Hill just used to leave the quarterback meetings just to rip cigarettes, which completely checks with how he looks. But anyway, so they're going into that game with Sean Hill. It felt like a wake. It felt like this season's over. What are we going to do? All this kind of stuff. That's how it felt, just like analyzing the game in my job at the time at PFF. And yet they go get Bradford. Now, we've seen it before. Like Tannehill got injured with the Dolphins. They go get Jay Cutler. I think when Bradford got injured for the Rams, they just started Sean Hill. The world goes around that way, I guess, Simba. But like when you're a team and you have all these expectations, and then for some random reason those expectations get turned on their head, what are you able to do? Like, what did you and Arthur ever sort of like talk about this? Did you ever sort of scenario plan? Like, was there ever a situation? I know I want to be semantically responsible, but like, let's say if Matt went down in August, would you ever just say, hey, we're going to play this season for a high draft pick? And we're just going to play the players we have. We're not going to try to, for lack of a better term, we're not going to try to get better. We're in a bad situation. Like, what goes through people's minds there? Because invariably there's one team every single year for which that happens. And it's always interesting to me, the approaches they take after it.
Well, we could talk about the quarterback position. We had other positions that went down that were really important for us. But to your point, we never had a quarterback in my go down in my 13 years in Atlanta. And even in New England, I mean, we always had someone there. I will say we were flying by the seat of our pants. Matt Ryan, literally 1.5, I've said this many times, 1.5 games injured in his entire career. We were so damn spoiled. It was only probably the last 5 years Arthur would knock on my door like, what in the hell are we doing with our number 2? We did not. I mean, that was a little cavalier of myself, and at that time, Dan. It ultimately was me. I mean, I was cavalier about it. I'm like, look, we have who we need. Our guy is very, we'll continue to bring our young guys in here. So when you're thinking about that and you have those discussions, the what ifs with your owner for sure, is an understanding that if our quarterback goes down, we are going to be doing all we can to keep respectability. But the reality for us to go out and bring someone in to take us to the promised land is unrealistic. Luckily, Arthur had that mindset about him as well, meaning he would love us to find the right, answer, but rarely was it. Only until most recently, when you start seeing some of this happen, I started thinking, my God, I was like, I was just flying by the seat of my pants. We should have been focused, on the Purdy's of the world. And I wasn't. I raised my hand. I would do it completely different in today's world. And I don't think an owner would have as much understanding towards the GM, right? And empathy or sympathy towards the GM. I think they would be all up his stuff, right? If that happened in today's world and you didn't have an answer, that'd be tough.
Yeah, they would. Right. I mean, you opted for Matt Schaub for a bunch of years, who was competent, but interestingly, those guys are somewhat expensive because they're veterans too. And then you had the TJ Yates of the world and the Chris Redmonds of the world. And like, Chris Redmond was like a relic of the old Bobby Petrino days too, right? Didn't he play for Bobby at Louisville or something?
No, Chris, when we came in, Chris was our, I don't know, for 2 or 3 years. And we hung with him because he, had a great relationship with our organization.
Yeah.
We thought we're focused on this young guy that we have. And yes, you're right. We had guys through the years that we thought could get us through a game or two.
Yeah.
But no disrespect to Schaub and Yates and guys like, there were some good guys there. We didn't have an answer that was waiting in the bullpen for us.
Yeah, that was like the same with the Vikings with Sean Hill. Like if if Teddy would have got injured for a game, Sean Hill, and I think Sean even started the first game because Bradford wasn't ready, and you could just see it physically. The guy, 60 snaps in, he's dead, right? Like, and that arm's going to fall off and stuff. But to your point, it's sort of, and it's one of the reasons hopefully I can get you a opine on this. We were going to talk about quarterback stats. I think we'll wait till next Monday to talk about that because I love the conversation we're having here. I love the fact that they now have a third quarterback rule back, which gives some incentive to teams to carry a third guy. Because, like practice squad, when they in 2011 went from having the 46 guy be a quarterback to not, a lot of teams just decided they weren't going to have a third quarterback on the 53, which meant any team could sign him if they got into a bind, which means that these guys are never really learning this system much at all. And so you get into a situation where you're very much more likely, I think, rationally to do what the Chiefs have done and get a guy like Chad Henne in there. Chad Henne can get you a drive. You even got him a playoff drive for a touchdown against the Jags. But and he probably could win a game or two out of two, right? You want a guy to be 500 as your backup. But if Mahomes is injured for 6-7 games, you don't want him playing 6 or 7 games. The problem is the way the rosters are constructed now, there wasn't the incentive to have that third guy. And so you're constantly in sort of this mini-max problem with like, well, we want Nick Foles there because he gets along with Matt Ryan, but he can't play anymore. He's, and so it's really this tricky thing. And there was always that Tom Moore quote where they were like, well, why aren't you giving Jim Sorgi any reps? And he's like, well, if Jim Sorgi has to play, we're screwed. Like, we don't practice screwed. And so I see that side of it too. But to me, it's just that position is so important now. And you have 17 games, and where it used to be 16, and there's only one bye. So, like, I think back to like when the Chiefs had Matt Moore, and Matt Moore had to win 1 out of 2 starts for them to get the 2 seed to get the bye. Mm-hmm. And that was limiting Matt Moore. Like, let's get up to right where his limits are. But then the Chiefs won the Super Bowl that year because there were only 16 regular season games. There were 2 byes. So you got a break if you could get a backup to just get you over that hump. But now with 17 games and just 1 bye, your backup's got to be a little bit more long-standing, I think, than that. And it's tough because I don't think that there are more good quarterbacks now than there always have been. I just think that I think that the incentives are different.
I think the incentives are different. And again, when you're a scouting department and you start, I know we can opine on this forever on the backup quarterbacks, but when you're looking at your guys and you're trying to decide on who the next will be, there are all these other elements that will factor in, right? I remember at times being around situations where I worried about drafting another quarterback, right? How high could you draft a quarterback before it affected Matt Ryan's confidence? I know it sounds odd to all of us. The guy's making $30 million. Who cares? But if we went could we go up to the third and it'd be fine? If we went up to the second or first, and even though we're telling them, hey, we're waiting 4 or 5 years, those are the things that we start thinking about. It wasn't just Matt or the quarterback thinking about it. It's all the other people within the building talking about it, within the locker room. And, if you have some people that, and believe me, as secure as a lot of people are, not most people are in the NFL, there are all kinds of insecurities, right? You have to think about that, which is an interesting thought about, yes, you have to do what's right for the team. It's for the betterment of the team. But the betterment of the team also means that your quarterback who is playing is in a good headspace, right? If you're paying him that much money.
I mean, yeah, dude, like your friend Josh McDaniels saw it. I mean, and his situation was a little bit more direct, but you saw it. Like, he called the Patriots about Matt Castle when they had Jay Cutler, and Jay found out, and now all of a sudden your quarterback's Kyle Orton. Congratulations. Like, that's a tough, to your point about like individuals and how this thing works. Jalen Hurts, when the Eagles drafted him in the second round, Carson Wentz has never really recovered since then. So you do have to care. And, it's weird. Like, this used to happen more. Like, the Bears drafted Jim Harbaugh when McMahon was their quarterback in round 1. The Denver Broncos drafted Tommy Maddox of XFL fame in round 1 while John Elway was in the prime of his career. Mm-hmm. Steve Young was near the end, but they drafted someone named Jim Druckenmiller in the first round back then. And like, nowadays, if you would have drafted another quarterback in round 1 while Matt was still like a year or two, like 3 years away from retiring, I mean, Aaron Rodgers has still never forgiven the Packers for drafting Jordan Love, and Aaron was struggling. That team was like 6-9-1 and 7-8-1 and stuff like that. And that's an issue because obviously, as we've done the numbers at Sumer, after you get past about pick 10, quarterbacks are as long. I mean, you might as well buy a lottery ticket at that point. So it's a hard thing. And to your point, like that's why the GMs. That's why, you know, the job of a GM is not an easy one, and one that requires not only team building acumen, but also, you know, people skills and those kind of things, because you have to worry about those kind of things.
It's almost like, what did we say? Remember, I was saying the GMs were saying for the most part, it's not the player they miss on, it's the person they miss on. And You're exactly right. I mean, the idea of going in there and truly as an organization missing on someone's movement, right? Or his ability, if you have, 20 coaches and, 18 or 20 scouts, rarely are you going to miss on that guy's splayed right foot. I'm being facetious, right? You see that. It's making those really complicated decisions like that. You have half the fan base and your owner saying, wow, what a great move drafting that second round pick. And then all of a sudden things start going awry and people start saying, well, I can't believe Dimitroff and co decided to do that. They put Matt Ryan in a really funky space. His security and his confidence is wavering. What a dumbass. Can't believe that's so. It's just a weird navigating. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Well, and you have the other part of like, well, there's somewhere I lean sometimes, which is to say, if you put Jalen Hurts there and it messes with Carson Wentz's mind, then he wasn't the right quarterback to begin with. But you've already committed the money to him. He's your quarter. Like it's so funny. It's I have one of my good friends who growing up in Minnesota. Like he's always somebody who wants to stay like kind of in his suburb, right? And a couple of my friends will always be like, "Oh, why doesn't he want to go hang out with us?" I'm like, "Well, look, he's our friend. If we want to still be his friend, we got to go meet him where he's at." That's just the way things are. We don't have to be his friend anymore, but if we want to, we can't just sit here and complain about him. We either have to not invite him or go meet him where he's at. And that's team building too. Like you can bitch and complain about your quarterback all you want, but the guy that you gave the $30 million a year to is your quarterback, good or bad. And if Carson struggles with any sort of competition, well, you should have thought about that before you gave him the big deal. You know what I'm saying? Like that. So I get both sides of it and it's the same thing on like fourth down decisions too. It's like, well, if we can't pick up a yard, we don't deserve to win this game. And it's like, well, no, like you probably no, either you pick up the yard or you don't. Deserve to is not, a thing. And so it's funny. With quarterback, I understand the whole like team leader thing. I understand, especially with guys who are a little bit meeker, like the Wentzes of the world, where they're not as domineering, I think, as a presence. You do, I think, have to take that into consideration. There are some players the Patriots drafted Jimmy Garoppolo in the second round when Tom Brady was still 3 Super Bowls ago for them. And so some guys can react to it fine and some guys can't.
So you made a mention a little bit earlier of like Thomas, now you're on the vendor side. You have to get used to working during the summer. And yeah, we're working our butts off. You guys, by the way, I just segue into that a little bit. I mean, a lot has been going on. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on in Sumer, a lot of work, a lot of crossing T's, dotting I's in what we're doing without getting into a ton of detail right now. If I can flip it around on you, like where are you most excited right now with Sumer? We're in these quiet sort of dog days or whatever you call them right now. Like, where are you as it applies to, the community and moving forward customer related?
Yeah, I'm excited. Like, there's 87 games until the first week. So, historically, I've always been nervous about that number because, like, as it goes down, the more work that we have to get done. On the team side, it's always fun to hear about what the teams want. It's fun to see this movement. One of my good friends, John Park, just got the director job with the Cowboys. He brought over Sarah Mappelli, who's also one of my friends. So like, it's fun to see that movement happening right now. To me, I'm really excited because we have some really cool ideas for SumerSports.com that people who listen to the show, we had 45% increase this month to last month, which is awesome. I can't wait for people to go to SumerSports.com and be able to get lost in the data that we're going to be able to give everybody there. I think, people, there's the space is very hungry for the conversation you and I just had, which you're just never going to see anywhere else. And I think the space is hungry for statistics that will help people better contextualize the game. And, we're currently, in a position where we're collecting, emails, and we're sending out newsletters soon here. We have an article, Tej Seth wrote an article about quarterbacks. That's the highest, viewed article that we've ever had on SumerSports.com. So what I'm really excited for is, obviously, getting to see some of these things that we've pontificated about in the offseason happen. And then getting everybody who is so far such a loyal listener and patron of Sumer Sports to be able to get them, give back to them with a website that they all can, enjoy and use to their heart's content.
Well, I that I was just out in Reno at a speaking engagement with a whole bunch of casino executives. Talked a lot about GMing, so to speak, but there was a massive amount of discussion or interest, in LLMs, artificial intelligence, where we are with chatbots. Without getting into a ton of detail about that, there's so much excitement out there, right, about what large language models can do for all of us. And one of the points in that visit for me to go out there was to bring together my GM experience along with leadership and how it's going to be changing our approach to leadership, and how AI and LLMs are going to change our approach, how much more efficient and effective we can be, how much less amount or is there going to be a lesser amount of risk involved, the data, there's such excitement, coming from basically 6 months ago, or not 7 or 8 months ago, when OpenAI introduced ChatGPT, right? Now we're already on ChatGPT 4, right? I haven't missed something in the last few days, right?
No. Well, I think Microsoft had an upgrade to theirs that made theirs faster. I think that we're probably still a ways away from knowing who the best chatbot is going to be, or even if that is possible, or they're just going to iterate over each other. I will say that component is going to be a big part of the experience at Sumer. Like, what we want to be able to do is we want to bring the data science solutions to people who don't necessarily want to or haven't learned all of the steps in order to get a data science solution. So, somebody like Tej can go into his, Jupyter notebook, pull down the data, build a graph, and send it out on Twitter. What we'd love for you to do is log on to Sumer Sports and be able to make that same graph. And be able to ask for it. And then once that happens, Thomas, I think this is the great frontier, right? It's been this way in scouting. It's been this way in player eval. It's been this way in player acquisition. Once we get the intelligentsia to this place, then there's going to be all these other questions that we want to be able to ask with data science. And so to me, I'm excited to push the frontier forward so that we can continue to see the new questions and have the impetus to answer them.
I love it. It's exciting to be, at that spot and at the, frontier, and watching this all happen and continuing to get calls from my, contemporaries in the league who are very interested, of course, in what we're doing, interested in next frontier, don't want to be left behind. But they also understand that there's a fine line there, right? Mm-hmm. Never do they want, the next wave and the evolution to take over scouting and GMing, so to speak, and building. They want to be a part of it. And part of being a part of it, as we've talked about this, you guys continue to educate me as a former football person. That's going to be part of our job, is to continue to educate the football people so that they realize the benefits more and more of, what all of your understanding of data, LLMs, et cetera, are going to help them do their job better. Yeah.
One thing that I like about Sumer is that there's a subject matter expert sort of at every at every level. Obviously, you with player evaluation and also team building. We have, Chase with salary cap. We have Nolan for scouting, although you're also an expert in scouting. We have, I don't think that we're going to make a ton of progress unless we, there's some progress to be made on first principles for sure. And I think naivete can be a blessing once every nook and cranny has been turned over. But you need subject matter experts to sort of help you know which stone to turn at every turn, right? And so I always like that. I'm excited for us to continue that way on both the B2C side, so fantasy gaming, content, all that stuff, the chats and all that, and then on the B2B side, helping teams, helping your contemporaries make decisions with that are more driven by data and with the tools that we can offer them. I think it'll be a potent combination, and I think for the folks that listen to the show, both on the team side, I know there are many of you, and then also on the consumer side, like there'll be something for everybody here, so that you can whet your appetite. Because I know the football analytics space has taken some hits over the past year or so, and obviously that's an opportunity for somebody to come up and do it well. I think that we're very much in the obviously follow our Twitter, follow this show. We're giving you kind of a glimpse into what that's going to be, and then by late August, early September, you'll have that at your fingertips. Love it.
Thank you for riffing on that. Appreciate you.
Of course, yeah. Well, this is fun, Thomas. This last being able to host with other people has been different, but it's always fun to get to host with you. You have such incredible insight, and this time of year is a dead time unless you have the memories and the insight from a 12-and-a-half-year NFL GM. So our podcast is going to be like none other, especially this time of year. So for those of you that are listening in, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, tell a friend about the show. Go to manscaped.com, promo code SUMER. For Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been episode 69 of the SumerSports Show.